Hi all, thanks for having me speak today. I'm going to move through this really quickly because I've only got 7 minutes. So I'm discussing a project that we're working on currently, which goes by the acronym DISNIBS, which is Displacement in the Non-Breeding Season for Seabirds. It's funded by ORGIP and the Carbon Trust, and it's collaboration with BIOS, University of Liverpool, and CEH. Okay, so in short, this is a project to produce an individual-based model in IBM, which is something similar to this tool that you may be familiar with, which is called Seabird. But Seabird is in particular for the breeding season, and we would like something which extends this to the non-breeding season to give all year-round coverage. Okay, and the idea with IBMs is that it allows you to do sort of simulations of animals and kind of their complicated interactions with the environment, and do a sort of a what-if scenario. Says if I was to change the environment in some way, say with an offshore wind farm, what are going to be the consequences to these birds, and ultimately at some sort of demographic or population level. This project's been running for around about 18 months, and we're in the midst of the programming component, but it started with a design workshop where this IBM structure was devised. We had a bunch of experts sit around and think about all the ways that animals interact with their environment and the consequences of these interactions for, say, their energetics. Okay, and then ultimately, obviously, with the idea that we'll have some sort of counterfactual. In order to implement this, we've developed this software package called RoamR, and that's mainly what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, this is an R package. We've made it quite general purpose, so it ought to extend well beyond just seabirds and the non-breeding season. And for the stats nerds out there, the programming nerds, it's all been done in S4 classes, which sort of forces a certain formality of programming into the usual sort of free-form R code that you might have, and makes it quite testable and transparent and basically maintainable and robust for the future. Okay, and as part of this design process, we've sort of had to consider two sort of ends or extremes, one which is where we've got a situation where we've got very little information about an animal, and the other where we might have a great deal. Okay, so it's been designed with that in mind. In order to talk about data rich and data poor, from a programming perspective, we've had to define what we would consider to be the most complicated. And as a guide for this, and indeed for the underpinnings or the mechanics of this, we've considered hidden Markov models to be about as complicated as somebody might fit, say if they had really detailed tracking data. Okay, so these sorts of models can estimate quite fine scale interaction or parameters associated between the interactions of animals and their environment. Now, to talk maybe a bit about the programming side of things here, as I say, it's all been done in S4, and so without going into a lot of the details, this would give you some vague idea about how this works. We would take, say, this animal here, which is going to be our simulated animal. The way that it moves around the place is going to be governed by, say, its properties as a species, and then it's going to be moving around in an environment which is defined by lots and lots of sort of spatial temporal inputs, which could be, prey fields or sea surface temperature or coastlines. And then we have other spatio-temporal layers in here which relate to the inclusion or not of some sort of development. Okay, and ultimately this feeds down to the agent's condition. So this allows for the possibility of all sorts of different sorts of behavioral states. Okay, so you might have animals which are feeding, they may be flying, they may be diving. These have their own sorts of movement properties. And in particular, they've got different sorts of consequences or implications for the energy that these animals are taking in and out, and ultimately their condition. So thinking at the really extreme level, in terms of complexity, we might have this down to a transition probability matrix level where we can say something quantitatively about the probability of animals moving from certain states and the consequences that follow from that. Okay, bearing in mind, of course, we would most likely be in a data poor situation where we don't know this level of detail, but it is supported. We spent a great deal of time considering these sorts of inputs that come in. So as previously discussed, that was on the previous page, they were really talking about how the animals interact, how they move, and then we have a sort of a simulation framework, which is the environment with which they're going to interact. Okay, and so these are going to be generally sort of spatio-temporal structures. So they could be prey fields or sea surface temperature or terrains, and so these are all kind of a similar sort of thing, but we need to make sure that it's all very nice and tight and consistent because we're going to be dealing with all sorts of potential projections and resolutions and things like that. So that gives us our sort of the definitions for our agents, and then we have the definitions for the environment, and then these things will interact, okay, ultimately producing some sort of energy consequences for the agents. Okay, so it could be like where the colony is located. It can be where they like to feed, as represented by density maps and things like that. Okay, ultimately, what you get from this IBM is going to be a distribution of body masses across all of your agents. And now this allows the pairing of different sorts of scenarios. So you might have an agent under a non-impact scenario, and then you have that same agent under an impact scenario, and you do counterfactuals between those two things there and say what were the sort of the energy consequences of this particular development. And ultimately, this can lead through to links at a population level. The project is due to complete in May 2025. We're still in the midst of creating the package, which the beta ought to be released in March, and there are various other sorts of things running in conjunction with looking at the sensitivity of these models to the inputs on this, so various sorts of uncertainty analyses. There are also two case studies for two species, one which represents data rich and one which represents data poor, which is the guillemots and red-throated divers respectively. And that is about it, just under 7 minutes. Thank you very much.
My name is Kate Searle, and I'm going to be talking about the ORGIP project on quantifying mortality rates of displaced birds. So in terms of the mortality rate arising from displacement for seabirds, why is this quantity so difficult to measure empirically? Well, it's because it arises from a set of complex processes to do with disturbance, habitat alteration, and potentially a form of habitat loss. And these are affected seasonally, environmentally, and then there also may likely be differences between individual birds and how they respond, as well as potentially temporal attenuation over time. And then the changes in these behaviors may result in changes to life cycle and population processes, but populations are affected by a range of processes, including behavior, time activity budgets, energetics, carryover effects, and then population processes such as density dependence. So this complexity means that sublethal effects require long-term individual level monitoring to really link changes in behavior from displacement to subsequent demographic impacts through energetics onto breeding success and survival. Importantly, we need to address this question now because it's a key part of the ornithological assessment process for offshore wind. So this project really wanted to try and understand what we could do now to try and inform policy. And the two main aspects of this project that did so were an expert elicitation and then an emulation of statistical models. So I'll just briefly cover the recommendations arising from the expert elicitation that was done in this project by DMP Statistical Solutions and Earthness College. Elicitation is a formalized process to obtain estimates and their uncertainty when there's little to no direct eye data. So this is useful for mortality rates arising from displacement because there's essentially no empirical information on this at present. And it's a process that involves many experts, and it is a process whereby you can obtain estimates for the answer to a particular question, along with the certainty that those experts have in addressing that question. So here the question that the experts were answering was to try and estimate the additional mortality that would arise for seabirds, for 6 species of seabirds in both the breeding and non-breeding seasons, when they suffered displacement from an offshore wind farm. So the example we have here on the right is for Atlantic puffins, and it shows you the additional mortality in the non-breeding season for adult breeding birds, estimated by 7 different experts. The values for each expert are shown by 5 reference points that define the additional mortality. You can see that the elicited parameter values are then shown in box-style plots primarily determined by the median value, but also capturing uncertainty through percentiles. So in general, for puffins, the estimated additional mortality in the non-breeding season, as you can see, was relatively low, on the order of sort of 1 to 5%, maybe around 10% from some experts, with one expert actually having a much higher estimate of potential additional mortality, but also a wide range of uncertainty around that. So importantly, during the expert elicitation, there was very wide-ranging discussion to try and help experts answer the question about what additional mortality, what sort of levels of additional mortality we might expect to see. And two of the research topics that were highlighted by the experts were firstly that the way that the size of the population that might be affected by displacement mortality rates in the current process using snapshots from at-sea survey data are underestimates, and the experts were very clear that in reality they felt much larger numbers of birds would be interacting with offshore wind farms and potentially subject to displacement effects. And secondly, that the cumulative effect of multiple wind farms is very simplistically done at the moment. It's essentially just an additive process where effects are estimated in isolation and then summed together. And the experts felt that the consequences of this were unclear, but that they did feel it was very overly simplistic, with the possibility for either double counting or also underestimation of potential effects. So then moving on to the second main part of the project, this was the statistical emulation of the individual base model, primarily done by BIOS. So statistical emulation is a process that attempts to approximate a very complex model. So in this case, we use this method to look at the IBM seaboard. So seaboard has a range of inputs that can be derived. So for instance, the proportion of birds experiencing displacement or barrier effects, the area of footprints, the number of different wind farms being used in the simulation, and the distance from offshore wind farms to colonies of interest. The model then estimates impacts of offshore wind farms in terms of an impact on adult mass loss and also on chick mortality and subsequent adult mortality. So here we built a statistical emulator to describe the relationship between these seaboard outputs and the summaries of various seaboard inputs. And then we're able to use the emulator as a simpler, faster approximation to estimate the displacement mortality rates that seaboard would predict if it had been used in that instance. In terms of the application of the emulator, we did find in this project, primarily due to a small number of runs we were able to complete, that a substantial percentage of the variation was unexplained by the emulator, which meant that it couldn't reliably be used for prediction or to provide reliable estimates of displacement mortality rates. But there is ongoing work to improve the emulators involving training using a much larger suite of seaboard model runs, and this is currently underway in the NERC EcoWings project. In terms of the overall conclusions and recommendations, it considered three distinct sources of evidence regarding mortality rates of displaced birds: the rates currently used in assessments, the expert elicitation, and then the statistical emulator. The expert elicitation for 6 species revealed estimates of displacement mortality rates for adults in both breeding and non-breeding seasons that were typically below about 10% additional mortality, but the estimates relating to chicks were much less. There was much less agreement amongst experts than there was for adults, but there was generally consensus that chick displacement mortality rates were likely to be much greater than those for adults. And the statistical emulation showed that estimated impacts of offshore wind farms on mortality and mass loss in seabird were relatively strongly driven by the proportion of individuals likely to experience displacement within the model. So then finally, in terms of using this evidence in current approaches, it was felt that it was not currently appropriate to use displacement mortality rates arising from expert elicitation or the seaboard emulator in the displacement matrix in its current form, unless adjustments are made to account for the discrepancy in methods in terms of defining and estimating the number of individual birds at risk from displacement in each method. And as a result, the key recommendations from the project were to understand more work to understand site fidelity and turnover, and the impact of this upon displacement risk, to understand whether there is a potential for underestimation of effects within the displacement matrix in relation to this listening.
Hello everyone, my name is Grant Humphreys and I'm the Director of Black Box Data Science. I'm here today to talk to you about the Imputus project, which is a project funded by ORGIP and the Carbon Trust and is focused really on understanding the distributional responses of seabirds at offshore wind farms. This project is being done in partnership with the Biodiversity Consultancy, DMP Stats, and NIRAS. So as we all know, uncertainty in displacement rates can lead to increased risk and the higher likelihood of concluding adverse effects at offshore wind farms. So what this project is really aiming to do here is to provide a better understanding of the uncertainty in displacement rates, and also to hopefully come up with some improved parameter estimates or a methodology to come up with improved parameter estimates based on existing data sets. So this is being done by way of a literature review where we look for existing data and then come up with a method that we can then apply kind of across all of those data sets in a way, kind of a harmonized approach. This will end up in a workshop and then an independent evaluation afterwards. So I just want to go over some of the outcomes from the literature review. Then I'll talk a tiny bit about the methodological section, which is kind of where we're at right now, and kind of the upcoming plans and what tangible impacts will come out of the project. So, as you're probably aware, there have been several reviews that have already been published looking at distributional responses at offshore wind farms, some relatively recently. The Lamb et al. 2024 report being one of those. And Lamb et al. 2024 covered up till about 2022. So we've kind of built on that and then covered up to what exists today. So from literature review, we've identified 76 studies in total. That's 23 in addition to Lamb et al. 2024. And that's just a testament to the fact that there's been lots more work done on this over the last few years. Of all these studies, 22 of those used boat-based surveys and 15 used GPS telemetry, and that's by far the largest method that was that's published on. So once you dig down into the literature review, what we find is that northern gannet is the most covered species with 31 studies. This is followed by kittiwake, guillemot, razorbill, and divers, with all other species or species groups kind of falling out underneath that. Interestingly, what we see here in a lot of cases is that there's almost a 50-50 split in terms of the number of studies that indicate some sort of significant displacement or attraction versus studies that don't show any significant displacement or attraction at all. So in the case of northern gannet, you've got 14 species that show significant displacement and one study that shows significant attraction. So those, that means that there's 16 studies in here that don't show any significant displacement or attraction at all. Black-legged kittiwake, that's the species group or species that has the sort of like widest disparity between the number of non-significant and significant studies. So 17 studies showed no significant impact in terms of displacement or attraction, and 9 studies showed either displacement or attraction. Of those, 3 showed significant attraction. In terms of guillemot, razorbill, and diver, these were nearly 50-50 splits in all cases. So what we're looking at is a lot of sort of mixed signals we're getting in terms of whether or not these animals are being displaced at offshore wind farms. The literature review also looked at the methods used, and it was a combination of different methodologies, including selectivity indices, control impact, before-after control impact, density surface models, and the like. We also took a look at the most applied covariates in some of these reviewed studies and models. And what we obviously find is that season month is, the most included one. Relatively straightforward model component to get because it's kind of built into the data. So, and water depth or bathymetry is another one that's commonly included. So 20 studies included season month. Of those, 16 found that there was a significant effect, probably not surprisingly. With bathymetry, 17 studies were incorporated, 13 found that there was some significant effect. In some cases, like wind direction, for example, 7 studies included wind direction, and of those 7 studies, all found that wind had a significant effect on the outcomes of the models. Wind speed was also one that had a significant impact, and 100% of the studies that it was included in. So we're currently in the process of the methodological development, which is being led by DMP Stats. The real goals here are to create a feasible best practice guide, and also to evaluate all the accessible data that we have. And this is going to cover things like modeling approaches, what kind of outputs you need, data requirements, and storage as well. For this part of the study, we've got 14 data sets, or just over 14 data sets that we've been able to obtain. So this covers about 25 offshore wind farm developments, and we're currently working on building the plan, and that's going to all be subject to a feasibility assessment or a stage gate, which will come up relatively soon. Once we pass through the stage gate, then we'll be processing the data and then building the best practice guide. So again, just to reiterate, in terms of tangible impacts, what we're looking at is a best practice guide. We're also going to look at the potential impacts on existing and future EIAs as best we can. We're also going to look at identifying gaps in data, so species regions, if possible. It's a bit tricky because we don't have access to all the data. However, we can look at it in a broad brush. And we're also going to make an assessment of displacement uncertainty between these sites and studies. Thank you very much, and we're looking for a project end date in about summer 2025, so keep your eyes to this space.
Hello, I'm Esther Jones. I'm going to talk about Closing the Loop, which is a feasibility study to determine a feedback approach for post-consent monitoring to reduce consenting risk in future assessments. This work is funded by ORGIP and project managed by the Carbon Trust. There's currently no strategic feedback mechanism or requirement for data collected during post-consent monitoring to be integrated into cumulative assessments. There's potential to maximise the value of existing data and shape future data collection through defining feedback processes and producing transparent requirements for future data collection in a defined strategic approach. These will be delivered in a set of recommendations and a roadmap towards the end of this project, with the aim to try and remove barriers to closing the loop. The benefit of using these data effectively could be to reduce uncertainty in the consenting process, and it's critical that in the context of current assessments, cumulative and future project-based assessments, that we try to do this. However, this is a complex problem to solve because there are multiple barriers and any proposed solutions need to work comprehensively and cohesively across many different areas. The 3 sets of barriers that we're considering in this project are procedural, which are policy, process and data availability, scientific, which are technical and statistical, including the evaluation of transfer of evidence, and also future post-consent monitoring requirements. To try and get to the barriers and potential solutions, we've used a pluralistic approach, which is using mixed research methods to understand the barriers. And this is to take one overarching problem and try to solve it looking at multiple lenses. We assembled an interdisciplinary team with expertise in ecology and socioeconomic statistics, social science and ecology, and across a number of different organisations, including consultancy, policy and science policy communication. To do this, a identifying barriers and finding potential solutions, we went through a range of activities and a number of stakeholder engagement processes. The first stakeholder engagement activity that we did was semi-structured interviews, where the objective was to understand the procedural barriers within organisations and identify potential mechanisms for resolving these barriers. We also undertook a review of policy, process and data availability, including looking at key legislation and guidance, the current planning process, ornithological monitoring, current process of post-consent monitoring, data availability, as well as looking at possible transferable learnings from other countries. A lot of this project is focused on ornithological modelling, monitoring and seabirds, but there is some marine mammal components as well. But the next activity we did was a seabird review focused on scientific, technical and statistical barriers to how post-consent monitoring data can be used to improve cumulative in combination and future project-based assessments. The review consisted of reviewing data types collected and current assessment tools, including at-sea survey data, bird-based telemetry data, boat-based telemetry, including visual tracking, and as well as other data types. Lastly, we undertook a focus group workshop to get high-level feedback about the issues that we'd already identified and to develop consensus around the feasibility of some of the potential solutions. We also use this as an opportunity to discuss factors that should be taken into account when incorporating data and evidence arising from post-consent monitoring data within assessments. And we integrated all of these activities into a synthesis of evidence. The synthesis of evidence identified sets of barriers and potential solutions, categorised into procedural, data management and policy, dissemination and translating data into guidance, and technical. So I'm not going to go through each of these different solutions, but what I am going to do is give some context around the feedback that we had from the focus group workshop around each of these areas. So for procedural solutions, there was broad support for developing examples of how post-consent monitoring reports have helped update advice in the past and the need for additional resource and staff. However, in the workshop, there were concerns expressed about the feasibility relating to the financial and staffing limitations experienced by stakeholders across the industry within the current context. There was broad agreement that working together to establish greater clarity on responsibility and developing an annual evidence review programme was possible, but again would likely require some additional changes for resourcing. Under data management and policy, the focus group workshop indicated that support for the Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland to continue to invest in the marine data exchange and work closely to support developers in ensuring that data are fair and uploaded in a timely manner. It was noted that work is underway to improve the marine data exchange to provide a clearer overview of which data have been provided by developers to try and improve transparency on data availability. But there was uncertainty around whether the wording of site licenses and marine licensing conditions could be changed to specify fair data expectations and formats. For dissemination and translating data to guidance, there's broad support for government and industry to continue investing in strategic research projects for meta-analyses, although questions were raised about who would be responsible for consolidating data across multiple projects. And it was felt that it was feasible for OECA to take on the role in disseminating information on post-consent monitoring when papers and reporting becomes available. However, concern was expressed about the UK-wide applicability of OECA's remit, given that there are resource limitations on the ability of stakeholders across all UK administrations to be involved in OECA at this current time. There was broad support for the potential solutions around the technical issues, and these were felt to be feasible in some way in the current context, although in most cases they would also require changes in the current context. The next steps are forming a set of draft recommendations and a roadmap of which we'll have an industry-wide workshop to be held at the end of March, beginning of April, for additional stakeholder engagement. The project concludes at the end of May. So thanks very much to the project team and to our funders, and many thanks for listening. Please get in touch with any questions.